Welcome back to the Foundation in C# course. We are currently in Module 4, and this lesson we are going to cover property types. So in the last lesson, we covered auto properties only. The idea that you had what looks like a variable, but it has a get and a set at the end of it. In this lesson, we're going to kind of expand that into a larger set of options for you. Okay, so let's start with our Visual Studio and go File, New Project, and we're going to select a console app, say console UI, property types demo, and hit OK. And once that gets created, we'll put our console read line at the end. So let's go ahead and create right off the bat a new class. We're going to call it the person class. So our person model, and we'll make it public. That's the first thing you do. And let's start off by creating a few properties. First name, last name, and let's say age. Now, usually you'd probably capture instead of birthday, but let's just say in this application we're going to capture an age. It just makes things a little bit easier when it comes to talking through different options. So these are all auto properties, and this is how you'd set up a normal class that is going to hold data. So you have first name, last name, and age. But what properties allow us to do is to expand these gets and sets to allow for more information, or for allowing for protecting information. Okay, so let's see how to do that. So the age right here, it wouldn't be a valid age to say negative anything. So anything below 0 is not a valid age. Now 0 would be a valid age if we're talking about integers, because remember, if a baby has been born, let's say 5 months ago, are they 1 yet? No. Therefore, you call them 0. Now, normally you don't say this baby is 0 years old. We would say they're 6 months old, which is actually a fraction, which integers don't handle. So instead, we just say 0 for a whole number age. But this would allow for any number to go in there, any integer. And so another side of it is if we put 300 in there, that might be a valid age for a country or a building, maybe. Probably not, but maybe. But it wouldn't be a valid age for a person. And this is a person model. So really anything over about 125 would be outside the possible bounds of age. So we want to put some requirements on what can go in here. So instead of doing this property, I'm going to do a different property called a full property. So this is an auto property where it has just a get and a set afterwards. And once you see the full property, you kind of see where we got the auto property from. So type out prop. Now normally if we just do prop, that's an auto property. But if you start typing full and then tab, that'll create the snippet for the full property. So I tab twice, and it allows me to move my cursor between the different sections. Okay, so I'm going to keep it as an int. I'm going to say underscore age, and I'll call this property age. I'll hit enter. Okay, so this right here, right now, is the equivalent of this line. Now notice all this code gets condensed down into one line, and that's pretty cool. So that's why that's why Microsoft decided to put auto properties into the language, because we're doing so often just a standard get and a set. And so they said, well, let's create a shortcut by just saying, yeah, we're gonna have a get and a set. Now, what does this allow us to do? Well, remember that code inside curly braces gets run together, so you can actually have multiple lines inside these curly braces. And let's kind of expand them a little bit. So what do these curly braces represent? Well, this one is the get curly brace. So when you ask for the age value, this is what gets run. And what happens is it comes down here and says, okay, run the get command, which is everything inside these curly braces. And it just says return underscore age, which is up here. This is called a private backing field. And the standard way of creating this variable is to start off with an underscore and then camel case. And that indicates it's a private backing field and that we should not manipulate it directly. The only place we should manipulate it is inside of the age property itself. Now, in this case, we're just returning that value. So we're not really doing anything differently. Down here for set, what it says is whenever you're going to assign a value to this property, this is the code that gets run. And there's a special keyword called value, and that holds the value coming into the age property. And notice it just assigns it right to that variable. So again, this code right here is the same, is equivalent to this code right there. So why would we write out this full code? Well, we wouldn't if we're going to leave it like this. We'd use an auto property. But remember I said the age we would want to set up some boundaries for. What if we said if value is greater than or equal to 0 and value is less than 126, meaning it's a valid value. And then if we move this inside here, let's go ahead and fix that formatting. Now the age will only set if you have a valid age range. Now you might say, well, what do we do if we don't have a valid range? And that's up to you. You don't have a lot of options here. You could do nothing, which is what I'm doing right now, or what you could do is put an else statement in here and say throw new index, let's do argument exception or argument out of range exception. That sounds better. And say, not the parameter name, but the message. So we got to pass the parameter name too. So value. And the message is age needs to be in a valid range. Something like that. Okay, so you throw an exception. So if they try to do something that is not valid, you could say, oops, nope, we're going to throw an exception. Or if you didn't want to do this, you could just ignore it and then not set the age. Which the downside there is they think they've set the age, but they didn't. So let's leave it with an exception. So that's how you'd handle making sure that data coming in is good data. You can also work on the data coming back. So what if we had, I'm going to create the auto property first. Let's call it string. And we're going to call it SSN, which if you're not in the United States, this is a social security number. And that's a unique identifier that identifies a person in the United States. And it's something that we can guard. Okay, so it might be 123-45-67890. Whoops, 89. Like that. That would be a social security number layout. last 4 and give you the last 4 characters. But I'll say 5 back from the length, and then that's the start, and then the length is, I don't need a length because it's looking at the last 4. So whatever it is. So in theory, if this is my social security number, let's just grab this real quick. Don't know how I get 1 instead of 2 there. All right. So if this is my model of my social security number, and the length is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 characters. All right. So it's 11 characters long. And I want to go back 5. That's a starter spot. So back 5 would be 6. So position 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and position 6. I believe that'll give us what we want. If not, we'll adjust it. Okay? So the point here, though, is that I'm not going to return the full social security number. I have it, and I could show it to you, but I'm not going to. That way, what you see is just the last 4 digits, so that you know your data is protected by us, and yet we have the full value which we need. Okay? So that's how you can use full properties to mask data like this, or to limit data coming in like this. Now let's put these in action and make sure they're working the way we expect them to. So we come over here and say person model person equals new person model. Let's say that person dot first name equals Tim. Person dot last name equals Corey. Person dot age equals, let's start off with a full thing. It's not just this. So we've stored the full value, but whenever we display it, we only display the last 4 digits. That way we can use this property on reports or on printing back to the screen or whatever you want to do, and we're not exposing the user's data to the screen or to a piece of paper or wherever else. But yet we still have that full value. Okay? So that's some of the benefits of full properties. You get to do this kind of thing. Now the question is going to come up, how often do I do this? It would seem like We would always do full properties in all of this data validation. And the reality is, no, we wouldn't. And the thought process behind it is, if we do the validation here, notice what I have to do in order to do something. I have to throw an exception. I can't talk directly to the user interface because I don't know if this user interface is a Windows form or a console or ASP.NET. It could be anything. So in this case, it's console, but I don't know that it's always going to be console. So I have to throw an exception, and that's not really great. So usually what we do is we use auto properties, and then at some point before we put it into the database or before we approve it to go up the chain, we do data validation. And that's where we do a model check, where we check every property and make sure that it passes our checks. So it's not often that we do something like this. This is more of either a one-off situation or a special circumstance where you really don't want to have it changed. This, on the other hand, is actually more common because there are a number of fields like this. Social security number, credit card, maybe password. There's a lot of things you could be storing that might be in clear text. Now, obviously, we normally want these things encrypted, but does that mean your application can't decrypt them? Probably not, because you probably have to work with them. So we'd want to have some type of filter to make sure they come out as protected or in some way modified so that we don't allow that full view. Now, what else can you do with these properties that might be fun? Well, one of the things you can do is, let's kind of shrink these down for a minute. So we've seen these, so we'll just shrink them down for right now. And let's actually just go like that. Okay. So now we have a first name and a last name. They both have a get and a set. But what we can do is we can actually change these. Let's do private get and private set. Now what this allows us to do is, for first name, you can set it. Anybody can set it. So you can set it over here. That's fine. But you can't read it. Not from over here. Private means only inside these curly braces can it be read. Why is that helpful? Well, maybe there's something where you want to allow it to be set, but you don't want it to be read back out. Maybe you decide, you know what, social security number, we're not even going to show last 4 digits. You can set it, but we're not going to tell you what it is once you do. That might be an option. The other thing you do is you can do what last name is doing, which is anybody can read it, but only inside this class can you set it. That's a private set, which means it's over here. It's yelling at me. It's saying, you can't set last name. When would you use that? Well, there may be a case where you want to set up a value there's no need we have this variable here we can use. That's essentially the private get. So we have this set and no get at all because we'd actually call it directly from there. Okay, and only internally. We could also have something where a full property has only a get but no set. And here's a very common one of those. I'm actually going to type it out instead of using the snippet for it. So public string full name get return $, a couple of double quotes and a semicolon. And inside double quotes, I'm going to say curly brace first name curly brace last name. Now here's a cool thing is that this works and it's going to return a full name, which actually uses the properties already in this model. But the other thing is, notice that that first name is a private get. We can't read it directly outside this class, but full name can, because full name is inside this class. Therefore, it can put full name here or first name here because it has access to it, and now it can return it to the user. So the user can say, let's just come up here and say person.full name. Not a problem. Now you might ask yourself, well, how do I get around this one? That last name not being able to be set. How would I set it? There's a couple different ways. One is you could create a method in here that sets it. Maybe you have some sort of processing method that creates it. Maybe a password gets auto-generated or something like that. And that way, that's what would actually set the password, not a user typing something in. But in this case, it's our last name that needs to be set. What we could do is we could create a special type of method called constructor. Now there's a snippet for this, CTOR. If you tab twice, it creates a special method called a constructor. Notice it's not static. You don't want static. You want this part of the instantiated class. None of these get static. Now the class name is person model. The constructor's name is person model. Why is that? Well, because the constructor is a special type of method that gets run when you build your house. So when you say, let's go back over here. When you say equals new person model, that person model right there isn't actually the class, it's the constructor you're calling. Notice the parens at the end? That indicates a method. So you're calling a special method that was normally hidden. If you don't have a constructor, there's one behind the scenes, and it looks just like this. That's all it is. But you can specify your own constructor. So in this case, I could say, I tell you what, you pass in a last name. And then what I will do is set that property equal to the value you pass in. And since I'm in the same class as last name, I can do that. You can't do that. Over here, it's saying, nope, you can't do that. But down here, I can. Now, I have changed the constructor to take in one parameter. Over here, notice it's yelling at me now because the constructor I was calling had 0 parameters. And it's saying, nope, the constructor now has one parameter. It's called string last name. So I can say, well, sure, Corey. And let's go ahead and comment out this line down here. So now I'm passing in the last name to the constructor. It's going to set the last name, and I can't change it after that. Let's run this real quick. Make sure it runs. It does. It says Tim Corey, just fine. So it uses the constructor to set that value. What's the value of doing this? Well, one of the things you can do with a constructor is you can make sure that you have at least the minimum amount of data to start out with. So you can say a person has to have a first name and last name before we declare them a person. And so you can say, well, my constructor is going to pass in first name and last name. And then you're requiring them to pass that information in right away. And that way you're always setting up valid models. That's one reason to do it. Another reason might be because you're saying, you know what? This is just faster. Instead of writing these 4 lines of code after I write my constructor, I know I'll always need these 4 lines, and I know I'll always have them right away. Therefore, I'll put all 4 lines or all 4 parameters right in the person model constructor, and then just pass it in and assign them right away. And that takes care of it. So that's another option. However, at this point, I do not have the option of not passing in a last name. So what if I didn't want to do that? Well, we're going to cover this more later, but there is an option called method overloading. And again, this is going to come in module 6 with some of our advanced object-oriented programming techniques, but we'll cover the basics now. So if I said CTOR, which is the constructor snippet, and tab twice, it creates a second constructor. Now, if you notice, Visual Studio is not yelling at me. It's not saying you have 2 of the same method. Why is that? It's because of overloading. And what overloading allows us to do is say, you can have the same method name and pass in different values, and we'll treat them as different methods. We've already seen this at work over here with our console write line. Notice the +18 overloads. So if I were to say Control-Shift-Space to bring up that menu, notice I'm on 2 of 19, but there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's a lot of them. There's 19 of them with different options afterwards. These are actually 19 different methods that have the same name. And so it allows us to pretty much throw whatever you want in here. I mean, console write line is very forgiving. You can throw almost anything in there and it will figure out a way to print to the console. With this, we say, yeah, you want to pass in that last name in order to set it, but sometimes we don't. In which case, I want this blank one as well, which does nothing. But what it does do is allows us to call this method without passing anything, and it's still okay. Now, that does mean that my last name is blank, so Tim doesn't have a last name, but it allows it to be called. So again, +1 overload. So you can see 1 of 2. It's either a person model or a person model with a string last name. So that's a little bit of a bonus since we were already learning about read-only. But as you can see from what we've covered so far about properties themselves, we've got a lot of versatility here. We can have just a regular property with a get and a set, an auto property. And that's kind of standard. But then if you want to start dialing in some more specificity, we can do that. For auto properties, we make one private, either the private get or the private set. We can also, with a full property, just eliminate the set altogether and have just a read-only or just a write-only. So you got a lot of options to choose from. In general, though, just stick with auto properties. Type prop, P-R-O-P, tab twice, fill in the 2 values, the type and the name, and then hit enter and go to the next line. This is how you create models really quickly. It's just prop, tab, type, enter. So that's what I recommend for most things. But if you have to, kind of keep this in your back pocket, especially this one right here. This one's really helpful for taking multiple things and appending them together or creating some type of super property that takes the values from other properties and puts them together. So in this case, it's kind of useful to have a full name, first name space last name. And instead of repeating ourselves over and over again, by doing this code right here in other places multiple times, I just created a read-only property that doesn't even have a private backing field. You don't need one because it just returns the value from two other properties. Okay, so that's really helpful. Otherwise, in general, again, auto properties are the way to go. Okay, so that brings us to our tip, and that is in classes, use auto properties by default, and then move to full properties when needed. So know what full properties can do, know how private backing fields work, know how to do read-only or write-only, and how to limit some of those things or to combine some of those things for like a full name or something like that. But in general, start from the idea that it's an auto property unless you really need something else. Okay? And your homework for today is to create a class that has properties for street address, city, state, and zip code. And then add a full address property that's read-only. Okay? Pretty simple, but at the same time, it's going to give you some hands-on experience doing the most commonly used things. So once you're done that, and do it first, make sure you actually do it. Don't just say, yeah, I know how to do that. Actually do it. Once you're done, move on to the next lesson.